They thought Claire Bennett was just another unwanted guest who had wandered into a wedding far above her place in life. But before the night was over, the same people laughing at her would stand frozen in absolute silence. The Whitmore wedding glittered across the California coastline like something torn from a luxury magazine, crystal chandeliers glowing through towering glass walls while black-tie guests drifted beneath gold lights with champagne flutes in hand. A string quartet played softly near the marble staircase as valet attendants hurried between rows of imported cars worth more than most homes in America. And right in the middle of all that wealth and polished arrogance, Claire Bennett stepped quietly through the entrance wearing a simple cream-colored dress and carrying a small gift box wrapped in plain brown paper. Several heads turned immediately, not because she was loud, not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't look like she belonged there. The whispers started almost instantly. One woman near the champagne tower leaned toward her husband and muttered, "Is she catering staff?" Another guest glanced at Claire's modest heels and gave a restrained smirk before looking away. Claire noticed every stare, every pause, every subtle judgment, but her expression never changed. She simply adjusted the ribbon on the small gift in her hands and continued toward the reception hall with quiet grace. Then came the first crack in the evening. "Excuse me," a sharp voice interrupted. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the center of the ballroom in a silver designer gown that caught the chandelier light with every movement. Her diamond bracelet alone probably cost more than Claire's entire outfit. The older woman looked Claire up and down slowly, deliberately, her smile polite enough to hide the insult beneath it. "Can I help you?" she asked, though her tone made it clear she already believed Claire was a problem. Nearby conversations began fading as guests subtly tuned in. Claire offered a gentle smile. "I'm here for Sophia's wedding." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you are?" "Claire Bennett." The silence that followed felt almost calculated. Eleanor searched her memory, clearly failing to place the name among the wealthy families and social circles she approved of. Then her eyes dropped to the plain box in Claire's hands. "Oh," she said softly, with the kind of pity reserved for people considered beneath notice. "You're one of Sophia's charity connections." A few nearby guests chuckled under their breath. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the gift box, but she remained calm. "Sophia invited me personally." "I'm sure she did," Eleanor replied smoothly. "My daughter has always had a generous heart." The words sounded kind on the surface, but the room understood exactly what she meant. Claire wasn't viewed as a respected guest. She was being framed as someone Sophia had invited out of obligation. Someone unfortunate. Someone small. A young server passed nearby carrying champagne, and Eleanor gently intercepted one flute before offering it toward Claire with a smile too polished to be sincere. "Here," she said. "You'll probably feel more comfortable near the side lounge. The main family seating is already arranged." The humiliation landed quietly, but heavily. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances while others watched with open curiosity, sensing the tension building beneath the polished music and expensive decor. Claire noticed a bridesmaid near the staircase looking visibly embarrassed by the interaction, but nobody stepped in. Nobody challenged Eleanor Whitmore. Not in her own ballroom. Claire lowered her eyes for one brief second before answering softly, "That's all right. I don't need a special seat." Eleanor's smile sharpened. "Wonderful. Then we understand each other." And just like that, the social hierarchy of the evening had been publicly established. But what nobody in that ballroom realized was that Claire Bennett had already seen the helicopters landing beyond the coastal cliffs outside the reception hall nearly 20 minutes earlier. And the moment she saw them, she quietly understood that this wedding was about to become unforgettable. Claire moved quietly toward the side lounge Eleanor had pointed her to, passing tables covered in white roses and crystal candle holders that reflected warm gold light across the ballroom walls. The orchestra continued playing softly, but the mood around her had shifted. People were watching now, not openly enough to seem rude, but enough for her to feel the pressure pressing against every step she took. A waiter offered her champagne with an awkward smile that carried more sympathy than professionalism. Claire thanked him gently and took only a glass of water instead. Across the ballroom, Eleanor Whitmore leaned close to a group of wealthy guests near the grand staircase, occasionally glancing back toward Claire while speaking behind a perfectly controlled smile. Then came the second wave of humiliation. "There she is," a male voice said casually. Julian Whitmore approached with two investors beside him, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, silver hair slicked back with old money precision. Unlike Eleanor, Julian did not bother hiding his arrogance behind politeness. He studied Claire openly before extending a hand that never quite reached her. "You are the charity guest my wife mentioned." The nearby investors smirked immediately. Claire remained composed. "I am a friend of Sophia's." Julian chuckled softly as if she had said something adorable. "Of course." He turned slightly toward the men beside him. "Sophia spent years volunteering in arts outreach programs. She tends to collect emotional projects." One of the investors laughed harder than necessary. Claire noticed several guests nearby suddenly pretending not to listen while clearly hearing every word. The humiliation was becoming entertainment now. Social pressure hung over the room like invisible smoke. Julian gestured toward a smaller table near the service hallway where vendors and distant guests were seated. "You will probably feel more comfortable over there," he said. "The family section is becoming crowded." Claire could feel eyes turning again. A young couple near the dance floor exchanged uncomfortable glances. One bridesmaid looked ready to intervene before another quietly pulled her back. Nobody wanted conflict with the Whitmores tonight. Claire lowered her gaze briefly, then answered with calm dignity. "I do not mind where I sit." "Wonderful," Julian replied smoothly. "Adaptability is an important life skill." The investors laughed again. Claire walked toward the smaller table without another word, her cream-colored dress brushing softly against the marble floor while whispers followed behind her like shadows. But the moment she reached the side section, something unexpected happened. Sophia Whitmore suddenly appeared from the bridal suite upstairs, still half-dressed for the ceremony, her white satin robe flowing behind her. The bride's expression changed instantly when she spotted Claire seated beside the service corridor. "Claire," she said in visible confusion, "why are you sitting here?" Before Claire could answer, Eleanor stepped in immediately, her smile tightening. She preferred a quieter area. Sophia looked unconvinced. Her eyes moved from Claire to her parents, and then toward the surrounding guests who suddenly became fascinated with their champagne glasses. Tension spread through the ballroom in complete silence. Claire offered Sophia a gentle, reassuring smile. "It is all right. Really." But then Sophia noticed the untouched place card sitting on the empty chair beside Claire. No name, no formal seating assignment, nothing. And in that instant, the bride quietly realized someone in her family had intentionally erased Claire from the wedding arrangements. Sophia Whitmore stared at the blank place card beside Claire as the realization slowly settled across her face. The music continued in the background and guests kept smiling and sipping champagne, but beneath the polished atmosphere, tension had begun spreading through the ballroom like a crack through glass. "Mom," Sophia said carefully, trying to keep her composure, "why is Claire sitting back here?" Eleanor's expression remained perfectly controlled. "Darling, there was confusion with the seating arrangements. We handled it." Sophia looked unconvinced. "Claire was supposed to sit near me." Julian stepped forward before the conversation could grow louder. "Sophia, your makeup artist is waiting upstairs. This is hardly the moment to worry about one guest." One guest. The words landed harder than he intended. Claire noticed. Sophia's face tightened slightly with guilt. The bride looked back at Claire, clearly torn between embarrassment and family pressure. "I am all right," Claire said softly, saving her before the situation exploded publicly. "You should focus on your wedding." For a brief moment, Sophia seemed ready to say something more. Then Eleanor gently touched her daughter's arm. "Sweetheart, everyone important is already arriving." That word again. Important. Claire simply folded her hands in her lap, while Sophia slowly allowed herself to be guided away. But the damage had already been done. Several nearby guests had overheard enough to understand exactly what was happening. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked entertained. One woman whispered, "I knew something felt off." Another quietly replied, "The Whitmores care too much about appearances." Claire pretended not to hear any of it. A waiter passed carrying trays of lobster appetizers and champagne towers while guests in custom tuxedos laughed loudly beneath the chandeliers. Yet somehow Claire sitting quietly near the service corridor had become more fascinating than the wedding itself. Then came another shift. A middle-aged woman wearing emerald jewelry approached Claire's table with a sympathetic smile. "You handled that gracefully," she whispered. "Most people would have left by now." Claire smiled politely. Sophia means a great deal to me. You must know her very well to tolerate this. Claire glanced briefly toward the bridal staircase upstairs before answering. I knew her long before any of this existed. The woman looked confused by the statement, but before she could ask more, Julian Whitmore suddenly raised a champagne glass near the center stage to begin welcoming guests. Conversations faded instantly. Tonight, Julian announced proudly, two powerful families come together in celebration. Applause echoed through the ballroom. Our daughter Sophia is entering a future surrounded by influence, opportunity, and success. More applause followed. Claire remained still, but then Julian's eyes drifted toward the side seating area. And of course, he added with a faint smile, Sophia's generous heart has always welcomed people from every walk of life. A few guests laughed quietly again. The humiliation was no longer subtle now. He was turning Claire into a social prop in front of 300 people. Claire lowered her eyes for one brief second as the orchestra resumed playing softly. Yet even then, she never looked angry, only disappointed. And standing near the ballroom entrance, unnoticed by almost everyone in the room, the hotel general manager had just received a phone call that instantly drained the color from his face. He is here already, the man whispered in shock. Then he looked toward Claire Bennett sitting quietly beside the service hallway and suddenly straightened his tie with visible panic. The hotel general manager crossed the ballroom so quickly that several servers instinctively stepped aside to clear his path. His polished shoes echoed sharply against the marble floor, while tension quietly followed behind him. Claire noticed him approaching almost immediately, but her expression did not change. Around them, guests continued mingling beneath the golden lights, unaware that something inside the atmosphere had shifted again. The manager stopped beside Claire's table and lowered his voice carefully. Mrs. Bennett, he said with visible nervousness, we were not informed you had arrived. The words landed like a dropped glass. Two nearby guests froze mid-conversation. Claire looked up calmly. That is all right. But the manager looked anything but all right. Tiny beads of sweat had formed near his temple despite the cool ocean breeze drifting through the ballroom terrace. No, ma'am, he replied quickly. It is absolutely not all right. Across the room, Eleanor Whitmore noticed the interaction immediately. Her smile faded. Julian noticed it seconds later and subtly lowered his champagne glass. Something about the hotel manager's posture toward Claire did not fit the narrative they had spent the evening building. Respect like that was not given casually in places like this. The manager straightened his jacket before speaking again. Would you prefer we prepare the private coastal suite now, or wait for your husband's arrival? The room near Claire's table went completely still. One woman near the candle display blinked in confusion. Another guest quietly whispered, Private coastal suite? Claire answered gently, almost as if trying to protect the man from panicking further. Please do not interrupt the wedding on my account. But that sentence only deepened the mystery. Eleanor immediately began walking toward them with controlled urgency, her diamond heels striking the marble floor in sharp measured clicks. Is there a problem? She asked, forcing a smile. The manager turned toward her, and for the first time all evening, someone looked at Eleanor Whitmore without intimidation. Mrs. Whitmore, he said professionally, there appears to have been a misunderstanding involving Mrs. Bennett's accommodations. Eleanor laughed lightly, though the sound came out thinner than intended. Accommodations? She is simply a guest. The manager hesitated. Then came another crack in the evening. Mrs. Bennett and her husband own exclusive rights to the coastal property adjoining this resort. Silence. Absolute silence. Even the nearby orchestra seemed quieter for a moment. Eleanor's smile froze completely. Julian stepped forward quickly. I believe you are mistaken. No, sir, the manager answered carefully. The Bennett family finalized the acquisition last month. Several nearby investors exchanged confused looks. One man immediately pulled out his phone. Another guest whispered, the Bennett acquisition? That was a $400 million deal. Eleanor turned toward Claire slowly now, studying her for the first time without arrogance clouding her judgment. But Claire simply sat there calmly in her modest cream-colored dress, hands folded gently in her lap, like none of this mattered to her at all. Then the distant sound of helicopter blades rolled across the ocean cliffs outside the ballroom windows again. Louder this time. Closer. Conversations across the reception began fading one by one as guests drifted toward the glass walls overlooking the coastline below. Black vehicles were already pulling into the private entrance road near the terrace. And standing beside Claire, the hotel manager quietly swallowed before saying the words that finally made fear enter Eleanor Whitmore's eyes. "Ma'am," he whispered carefully, "your husband has arrived." The ballroom no longer sounded like a wedding. The orchestra still played somewhere in the background, but the music had become distant beneath the growing wave of whispers spreading across the reception hall. Guests drifted toward the towering glass windows overlooking the coastal entrance below, their champagne glasses forgotten in trembling hands as black SUVs rolled silently up the private drive one after another. Claire remained seated near the service corridor, calm and motionless while the atmosphere around her unraveled completely. Eleanor Whitmore stood frozen beside the table, struggling to regain control of a situation she no longer understood. "Who exactly is your husband?" she finally asked, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier arrogance. Claire looked up at her gently. "Someone who dislikes public attention." That answer only deepened the tension. Julian Whitmore immediately motioned toward one of his business associates near the bar. "Find out what is happening," he whispered sharply. But before the man could move, several hotel executives suddenly entered the ballroom from the main lobby in coordinated panic. Their expressions alone were enough to shift the room further into unease. One executive hurried directly to the hotel general manager and whispered something in his ear that visibly drained the remaining color from the man's face. Then all of them turned toward Claire. Not toward Eleanor. Not toward Julian. Toward Claire. The social hierarchy of the evening had just quietly collapsed. Sophia Whitmore descended the staircase in her wedding gown at that exact moment, her veil flowing softly behind her as confusion spread across her face. She looked from her parents to Claire, then toward the guests gathering near the windows. "What is happening?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately. Then the ballroom doors opened. Every conversation stopped. Michael Bennett entered without announcement, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that carried the kind of understated elegance impossible to imitate. He was not loud. He did not rush. Yet the entire room seemed to shift around his presence before he even spoke a word. Several guests recognized him instantly. One investor near the champagne tower muttered under his breath, "That is Michael Bennett." Another man nearly dropped his drink. "The Bennett Group?" A woman near the staircase whispered, stunned. "They said he was in Zurich this week." Michael barely acknowledged any of them. His attention moved through the ballroom calmly until it landed on Claire sitting alone near the service hallway. And then something happened that nobody in that room expected. Instead of heading toward the center stage or greeting the Whitmore family, Michael walked directly across the ballroom floor toward his wife. Past the chandeliers, past the investors, past the stunned silence hanging over hundreds of guests. Eleanor instinctively stepped aside as he approached. Michael stopped beside Claire's chair and noticed the untouched place sitting beside her. The missing name card, the isolated table, the quiet humiliation written into every detail. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. Claire looked up at him softly. "You are early." "I finished the meeting sooner than expected," he replied calmly. Then his eyes drifted briefly across the ballroom, taking in the nervous expressions surrounding them. "I see the evening has been eventful." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. The room had gone completely silent now. And when Michael Bennett finally reached down and gently took Claire's hand in front of everyone, several people suddenly realized the simple woman they had spent the entire evening humiliating was the one person in the ballroom they never should have underestimated. The silence inside the ballroom stretched so long that even the servers stopped moving. Crystal glasses hovered halfway to lips. Conversations died unfinished. Somewhere near the terrace, the orchestra quietly lowered their instruments, uncertain whether to continue playing at all. Michael Bennett stood beside Claire with one hand gently holding hers while hundreds of eyes remained fixed on them. Eleanor Whitmore struggled to recover first. Her smile returned, but this time it looked fragile. "Mr. Bennett," she said carefully, "if we had known Claire was your wife, tonight would have been very different." Michael finally looked at her directly. Calm, controlled, almost unreadable. "Yes," he replied softly. "That is exactly the problem." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Eleanor's face tightened instantly. Nearby guests exchanged uneasy glances while Julian Whitmore stepped forward with the polished confidence of a businessman trying to stabilize a collapsing negotiation. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding," Julian said smoothly. Claire was welcomed here. Michael's eyes drifted toward the isolated table near the service corridor. The missing place card. The untouched water glass. The visible distance between Claire and the rest of the family seating. Every detail spoke louder than excuses ever could. "Interesting way to welcome someone," Michael replied quietly. Nobody spoke after that. The room felt smaller now. Tighter. Sophia Whitmore slowly approached Claire, her wedding gown trailing softly across the marble floor. Unlike her parents, she no longer looked defensive. She looked ashamed. "Claire," she whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I did not know they treated you this way." Claire offered her the same gentle expression she had carried all evening. "I know." Sophia looked devastated by those 2 words alone. Because Claire had known. She had seen every insult, every deliberate humiliation, and still stayed for Sophia's sake. The emotional weight of that realization spread visibly through the room. One elderly guest quietly lowered his eyes. Another woman near the staircase shook her head in disbelief at how far the Whitmores had pushed things without understanding who Claire truly was. Then another shift came. The hotel general manager approached Michael carefully holding a folder with both hands. "Sir," he said respectfully, "the acquisition documents are prepared for tomorrow morning's signing." Julian's expression changed immediately. "What signing?" The manager hesitated before answering. The Bennett Group finalized controlling ownership of Whitmore Coastal Investments earlier this afternoon. A collective murmur swept through the ballroom. One investor actually stumbled backward in shock. Another immediately reached for his phone again. Julian Whitmore went completely pale. "That is impossible," he said under his breath. Michael remained calm. "Your board accepted the offer at 4:30 this afternoon." Eleanor stared at her husband in horror. Sophia looked like she could barely breathe, because suddenly everyone understood the full truth at the exact same moment. The Whitmores had spent the entire evening humiliating the woman whose husband now effectively controlled their financial future. But Michael still did not raise his voice. He did not threaten anyone. That somehow made the moment even heavier. He simply turned toward Claire and noticed a small stain near the edge of her cream-colored sleeve where champagne had splashed earlier during the chaos. Without hesitation, Michael removed a folded handkerchief from his pocket and gently cleaned the fabric himself in complete silence. The ballroom watched in absolute stillness, not because of wealth anymore, but because real love and respect looked nothing like the performance they had all been celebrating tonight. And for the first time since the wedding began, Eleanor Whitmore finally understood that Claire Bennett had never been the smallest person in the room. The ballroom remained suspended in a strange, fragile silence after the revelation about Whitmore Coastal Investments. Nobody seemed to know how to behave anymore. Guests who had laughed earlier now avoided eye contact. Investors who once surrounded Julian Whitmore with admiration suddenly stepped away from him as though distance alone could protect their reputations. The social gravity of the room had shifted completely, and everyone could feel it. Sophia stood beside Claire with tears gathering carefully along her lashes, her voice trembling beneath the weight of embarrassment. "Why did you not tell me?" she whispered. Claire looked at her softly. "Because I wanted to come as your friend, not as someone people felt obligated to impress." Those words spread through the nearby crowd more powerfully than any public accusation could have. Several guests lowered their heads quietly. One woman near the terrace muttered under her breath, "She never wanted status. They forced this." Eleanor Whitmore looked shaken now, but pride still fought to survive inside her expression. "Claire," she said carefully, "surely you understand this entire situation has become exaggerated." Michael slowly turned toward her. Not angry, not loud. Somehow that calmness felt heavier than rage ever could. "Your family publicly humiliated my wife for hours," he said quietly. Nothing about that was exaggerated. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Because for the first time all evening, she could hear her own behavior through someone else's eyes. Nearby, one of the older investors quietly stepped away from Julian and whispered to another businessman, "This is going to spread through every boardroom in California by morning." Julian heard it. The color drained further from his face. Then came another unexpected shift. Claire finally reached down and picked up the small gift box she had carried into the ballroom from the beginning of the night. The same plain brown paper. The same carefully tied ribbon that had looked so insignificant beside the diamonds and luxury surrounding it. She turned towards Sophia and gently held it out. "This was for you." Sophia accepted it slowly, almost afraid to touch it now. "Claire, open it later," Claire said softly. But Sophia shook her head. "No, I want it now." The room watched closely as she untied the ribbon with trembling fingers. Inside the box rested an old framed photograph. A younger Sophia stood smiling beside a group of teenage art students in front of a tiny community theater with peeling paint and broken windows. Sophia stared at the image in confusion at first. Then her eyes widened. "Wait," Claire nodded gently. 10 years ago, your school almost shut down its arts program." Sophia looked up slowly. "The anonymous donor helped fund the scholarships," Claire finished quietly. A hush fell over the ballroom, so complete that even the ocean waves outside suddenly seemed louder. Sophia's hands began shaking as memories flooded back. The art scholarship had changed her life. It had allowed her to stay in school, continue performing, eventually build the career that led her here tonight. And all those years, the woman who saved that future had never once taken credit for it. Eleanor stared at Claire in complete disbelief now. "That was you." Claire simply smiled faintly. Sophia deserved a chance. Michael watched his wife quietly, pride visible even in his silence. Because this was the truth nobody in that ballroom had understood when Claire first walked through those doors. Her worth had never come from money. The money was simply the smallest part of who she really was. No one in the ballroom seemed capable of returning to normal after the photograph. The chandeliers still glowed overhead. The ocean still rolled quietly beyond the glass walls. Yet the entire atmosphere of the wedding had transformed into something heavy with shame and realization. Sophia clutched the framed picture against her chest while tears slipped carefully down her face, ruining the flawless makeup that had taken hours to perfect. "You saved my future," she whispered. Claire shook her head gently. "You built your own future. I only opened a door." The simplicity of that answer struck the room harder than any display of wealth ever could. Nearby guests who had spent the evening admiring luxury suddenly found themselves staring at a woman who had quietly changed lives without demanding recognition for it. Eleanor Whitmore looked completely different now. The sharp confidence that had defined her all evening had faded into visible regret. She glanced around the ballroom and realized something terrifying. People were no longer admiring her family. They were judging them. Soft whispers spread through the guests like slow-moving waves. They humiliated her. She paid for Sophia's scholarship, and they sat her beside the service hallway. Eleanor finally stepped toward Claire with trembling restraint. "Claire," she said carefully, "I owe you an apology." The room became still again. Claire looked at her calmly, but did not answer immediately. Eleanor swallowed hard beneath hundreds of watching eyes. "I judged you by appearance," she admitted quietly. "And I was wrong." It was the first honest sentence Eleanor Whitmore had spoken all evening. Claire studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." No triumph. No cruelty. No desire to humiliate her back. That somehow made the moment even more painful for the Whitmores. Julian stood silent near the stage, staring down into his untouched champagne glass, while investors slowly drifted away from him one by one. For years he had built his reputation on status, exclusivity, and influence. But tonight, in front of everyone who mattered most to him, those things suddenly looked empty. Then Sophia turned toward Michael with red eyes and trembling hands. "Please," she whispered, "do not punish my family because of this." Several guests held their breath waiting for his answer. Michael remained calm. "Your family's business decisions will be handled professionally," he replied. "What happened tonight is separate." Sophia nodded slowly, relief washing through her face. Because even now, after everything, the Bennetts were showing more dignity than anyone else in the room. Claire gently touched Michael's arm before stepping towards Sophia again. "You should enjoy your wedding," she said softly. "Do not let this become the memory that defines it." Sophia let out a quiet emotional laugh through tears. "How are you still being kind to us?" Claire's expression softened. "Because humiliation already teaches its lesson." Another silence followed. A deeper one this time. Not awkward. Reflective. Guests who had arrived expecting luxury and spectacle now stood confronted by something far rarer. Grace. Near the terrace windows, the orchestra slowly began playing again, softer than before. Waiters resumed moving through the ballroom cautiously. Conversations returned in careful whispers. But nobody looked at Claire Bennett the same way anymore. Not because of the helicopters. Not because of the acquisition. Not even because of Michael Bennett's wealth. They looked at her differently because she had every reason to destroy the people who humiliated her tonight, and instead she chose restraint. And in that ballroom filled with diamonds, status, and polished appearances, restraint suddenly became the most powerful thing anyone had witnessed all evening. An hour later, the wedding finally resumed beneath the soft glow of chandeliers and candlelight, but the atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed in a way nobody could undo. The laughter was quieter now. The conversations more careful. Guests who had once measured worth through designer gowns, investment portfolios, and last names now seemed strangely aware of how fragile those things really were. Sophia walked down the aisle with tears still lingering in her eyes, clutching her bouquet a little tighter than before. And seated near the front beside Michael, Claire watched with the same calm grace she had carried through the entire evening. This time, nobody questioned where she belonged. Eleanor Whitmore sat stiffly through most of the ceremony, her expression distant beneath the glow of the altar lights. Every now and then her eyes drifted toward Claire before quickly looking away again, as if the weight of her own behavior had become difficult to face for too long at once. Julian remained unusually quiet beside her, his confidence stripped down to silence. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Ocean waves rolled softly beyond the glass walls while the orchestra played gentle piano melodies that floated through the room like memory. Yet for many guests, the wedding was no longer the thing they would remember most about that night. It was the woman in the simple cream-colored dress who had been underestimated by nearly everyone in the room. During the reception dinner, something unexpected happened. One by one, guests began approaching Claire quietly, not because of Michael Bennett's wealth, not because of the acquisition, but because shame has a strange way of making people honest. A woman admitted she once ignored a coworker because of how she dressed. An older man confessed he spent years judging people by what neighborhoods they came from. Even one of the younger bridesmaids sat beside Claire for several minutes in silence before whispering, "I hope I never become the kind of person who makes someone feel small like that." Claire listened to each of them patiently, never acting superior, never making anyone feel worse than they already did. And somehow, that kindness lingered heavier than humiliation ever could. Near midnight, as the ballroom slowly emptied and black cars disappeared into the coastal fog outside, Sophia found Claire alone near the terrace overlooking the ocean. The bride removed her heels and stood quietly beside her for a moment. "I used to think success meant finally being accepted by people like my parents," she admitted softly. Claire looked out toward the dark water below. "Most people do." Sophia swallowed hard. "Do you think they will ever really change?" Claire was silent for several seconds before answering. "Sometimes people only see clearly after they lose the comfort of believing they were better than others." The ocean wind moved gently through the terrace curtains. Behind them, the ballroom lights reflected across polished marble floors that had witnessed pride, humiliation, regret, and grace all in the same night. Sophia looked down at the old photograph still resting carefully in her hands. "I almost forgot where I came from," she whispered. Claire smiled faintly. Then maybe tonight was important after all. And long after the music ended and the guests returned to their lives, many of the people who attended that wedding continued remembering one uncomfortable truth from that